Well, we've experienced this unprecedented fall over the last few years. Our sense is that we are starting to come out of that. So living standards in terms of household incomes for the typical household in this country were broadly flat over the last year or so. We expect that to stay much the same this year and turn positive in 2015, which is a kind of interesting year for them to be turning positive in terms of politics, but only just positive. And our view is that they're likely, based on the information we have at the moment, to grow, but at a very sluggish rate for the few years after that. So coming out of these big falls that we've seen, then flat and then very gentle increases. Whether that will feel like a real improvement to households is another question. I think there's almost an extent to which people have been talking so much about austerity and cuts, and now we've got some growth, that there's almost a sense that maybe we're through the worst of it and almost behind that phase, and maybe we can perhaps see some sunny uplands in terms of public spending. But actually, based on the current plans, the deepest cuts to public services particularly are still to come. We're not halfway there yet. The biggest cuts we've seen so far have been to capital spending, which are actually politically easier to pull off, and the current spending for public services, the big hit is yet to come. What that means is, it will play out very differently in different areas. So I think it's very likely that whoever wins the next election, some areas will remain more protected relative to others. So I expect those areas which are unprotected will see some really, really severe hits, and that's why I think local government, particularly social services, are right in the firing line. I mean, housing budgets have been hit incredibly hard, but I think other areas which are also politically sensitive, like defence, I think will really take off as an issue, because I think the planned cuts there are likely to be very severe. So I think you'll see a quite differentiated approach. But the other point to make is that even in the relatively protected areas, like the NHS, which is being protected in real terms, and I think will carry on being so all the way to 2018-19, I find it hard to believe that the NHS will actually live just with what is called flat real, no real terms increases. The NHS has historically lived on 3.5% real terms increases year on year, and at some point I think politics will take over. There'll be a public reaction to what will be perceived as a lack of funding in the NHS, even though it's protected compared to other places. And I think it'll be quite likely in the next Parliament to see whoever is in power actually putting more resources into the NHS, even though it's been better protected than almost any other domestic area. My sense is that on current plans, something's got to give. There's different things that can give. My caveat to that would be is if growth is a bit faster than projected, then perhaps we could actually get rid of the underlying deficit on the current timetable, and that could happen. Growth this year is a bit higher than the OBR thought it was going to be, so that is a possibility, and let's hope for that. If that's not the case, and GDP growth is actually in line with current expectations, then I think we have a real problem. I personally, and who knows, but I personally don't see the scale of cuts, particularly to those non-protected areas, being delivered. I think all manner of objection will be raised, and I think at some point the pain of sticking to that timetable will be actually less than the pain of shifting it. And you can either shift it by raising more in tax, or you can shift it by spreading those cuts over a slightly longer period of time. It wouldn't surprise me if we saw a bit of both. And tax rises, look, they're always going to be painful, not least when living standards are only going up a bit. People don't want to be asked to pay more. But there is a historic trend in this country that you often see tax rises in the first year after a general election, almost regardless of what gets said before that general election. It's not a particularly nice thing to say, but there is a pattern, and I would not be surprised to see that pattern replay itself.